Thank you, Paul. I'd like to thank Paul and Pretty and Dave Peku for inviting me to present today on web accessibility fundamentals. We saw by show of hands that not everybody here is an accessibility expert. We would like you to leave with the feeling that maybe you're a web accessibility expert, at least certainly more versed in web accessibility. I'm going to be focusing more today on the why of web accessibility more than the how of web accessibility. The how will come in the other sessions. So I think it's important to start maybe with a definition of accessibility, and I think you'll see as we go along through these 2 days that defining accessibility is not really that easy. It's a very complex thing because people are complex, and that's what accessibility is about. It's about human experience, about human accessibility. This is a definition that I like. Development of information systems flexible enough to accommodate the needs of the broadest range of users, regardless of age or disability. Really what we're doing is we're talking about giving people an opportunity to get to our stuff, and giving them a chance, at least to experience the interactions, the content that are available to them. It's important to note that accessibility is a continuum. Anytime somebody comes to us and says, oh yeah, my website's accessible, that doesn't really mean anything, right? Accessibility has to be quantified. Accessible to whom? Accessible to what level? So I like to view accessibility as this continuum, which means we can always be more accessible, which by definition means that we will always be inaccessible to somebody, and that's okay. We need to accept that. If your goal is 100% perfect, absolute, total accessibility, in some ways you've failed before you've even begun. But it's important that we have these definitions and quantifications of accessibility to help us know at least where we're at along that continuum. It's a process. And as I mentioned, it's never really fully reached, but we can reach certain measures or thresholds of accessibility along the way. Accessibility also encourages good design and development practices. I think for those that do accessibility, I think you really realize that, how much it promotes good, clean code. Supports search engine optimization. If you think about it, Google is blind, Google is deaf, and Google doesn't use a keyboard. That's kind of the way the search engines work. Much of what we talk about in accessibility is making content machine readable, so a computer can take that content and present it to the user in a meaningful way through technologies. By making content machine readable, you're making it more, not necessarily search engine optimized, but at least search engine friendly, because there's machine readable content there. Also supports internationalization, because you're talking about good content, generally text content, and that can be translated and so forth. Also supports mobile friendly content, adaptable content, responsive content that can be viewed by a wide variety of technologies. We know about 20% of the population has a disability, 1 in 5. That'd be this portion of the room. Now, most of those are age-related things, but yeah, that's pretty notable. About 20% of the population. Of those, about 8.5% of the population has a disability that affects computer use. And that's a pretty minimal number. It doesn't include most users with cognitive or learning disabilities. It doesn't include those with color deficiency or color blindness and so forth. So you might ask yourself, how notable, that's often a real initial question with accessibility. What is the real benefit to users? And you can ask yourself whether 8.5% is significant or not. I would argue that it is for many reasons, but probably more important than that, while accessibility focuses on people with disabilities, accessibility benefits everybody. By making content accessible, everybody is going to benefit. I want to take just a minute and define a term here of assistive technologies. How many of you are familiar with that term, assistive technologies? Okay, about half of you. Very basically, it might be defined as a technology that maybe due to a physical issue or limitation would allow someone to function in a way that otherwise they'd be unable to. So with that definition, is there anybody here that uses some form of assistive technology that based on a physical issue or limitation? If you didn't have that technology, you'd have difficulty functioning the way that you do every day. A couple people, a few more hands going up. I can actually tell that there are quite a few people here that use some form of assistive technology. There we go. How many, just by show of hands, how many of you wear glasses or contact lenses? Okay, more than half. You guys spend way too much time looking at your computer screens, I think. How many of you that wear glasses or contact lenses would have difficulty functioning the way that you do if you did not have that assistive technology? Almost everybody that raised their hand before. So here's an interesting question. Do you have a disability? Maybe you haven't really considered that. Would you have a disability if you did not have that assistive technology? Kind of sounds like it. Maybe if you'd have difficulty functioning. So a lot of what assistive technology does is it kind of makes the disability irrelevant. Not totally irrelevant, right? You still have to wear your glasses or put in your contacts, but because of that assistive technology, you can function in a way that doesn't really matter, especially when it comes to web content. And that's the way assistive technologies work for all disabilities. How frustrating would it be for you to come to a website that doesn't work with glasses or contact lenses? Right, that'd be pretty frustrating, pretty arbitrary. That's a lot of what we talk about with accessibility, is making web content compatible with those assistive technologies. And when we do that, the disability, whether someone's blind and maybe using a screen reader as assistive technology that takes text content and reads it audibly to them, or a screen enlarger for someone with low vision, maybe takes that content and makes it larger so they can read it, or captions or transcripts, or keyboard or switch device accessibility so people can interact with content using the technology that they need. All these various types of assistive technologies, and make it on the web at least so that it doesn't matter if the user has a disability, they can still access and use that information and functionality. So it's maybe an interesting way to think about that. Kind of inverse to that, if you don't make your content compatible with those assistive technologies, in some way you have disabled that person, right? It doesn't really matter until you present that technology, that assistive technology, with something that doesn't work. Everything else that we talk about in web accessibility makes things better for everybody, right? It's just good usability and just good best practices to help everybody. Now, going back to that 8.5% of the population, maybe it's a little bit selfish, but one way we can look at that is, oh, hey, we can expand our market to that 8.5% of the population. Accessibility doesn't really work that way. The web generally is not all that friendly to people with disabilities. Those websites, those resources out there that are accessible, that's where people with disabilities are going to go to get their information and do their shopping, get their education, whatever it might be, because those are accessible. There are a few, there are people that are really seeing that vision of not only expanding their market, but targeting and really marketing to that 8.5% of the population. One interesting example, several years ago, they held this meeting, some of the brightest minds in accessibility, to consider the accessibility of touchscreen devices. And kind of the conclusion of this research was, wow, touchscreen devices are a black hole of accessibility. You just cannot make these accessible to somebody that can't see them. And shortly after that, Apple released a very accessible iPhone. Screen reader technology built into it, comes native with the device, and really very accessible. It's not perfect, there are improvements being made all the time, but had accessibility built in, and kind of flipped this whole concept of accessibility in general, especially touchscreen accessibility, on its head. So if you're a blind user and you want a kick-ass phone, what are you going to buy? A phone that's inaccessible to you, or an iPhone that's accessible to you? Of course you're going to buy an iPhone, and Apple sees that vision. And we go to a lot of disability conferences, and 4 or 5 years ago you see a couple iPhones, and 3 years ago everybody had an iPhone, and 2 years ago everybody had an iPad and an iPhone, and last year everybody had their MacBook Pro and their iPad and their iPhone. They were talking about people with disabilities. We've really seen a significant shift to Apple products because of that vision of accessibility. And other technologies are certainly coming along. This is a great example, I think, and maybe it's selfish, but wow, we really can not only target this audience, but we can have a significant impact in the lives of people with disabilities. Now, I mentioned before this continuum. Guidelines are measures along this continuum of accessibility. We have a few measures or guidelines that we can refer to. First, we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1.0, or WCAG, or WCAG. If someone says WCAG, that's what they're talking about, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. International set of guidelines formulated by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, the international standards body for the web. Now, version 1.0 of these guidelines was finalized in 1999. What do you think about in regards to the web when you hear 1999? Right? This is like the horse and buggy days of the web. Think about, we're doing pretty much text, images, and very basic forms, and that's what WCAG 1.0 refers to as pretty basic HTML technologies. That should be your first real big red flag regarding these guidelines. These guidelines were very checkpoint driven. What that means is you can look at the guidelines and you can say, oh yeah, my website does that, and check a box. Yeah, my website does that, and check the box. Check, 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 check. Check all the boxes, then you can say, yay, my website is what? Accessible? Not necessarily. You could at least say that it's compliant, right? It at least met those guidelines, at least met this measure along the continuum. And that's important to note, that compliant doesn't necessarily mean accessible, certainly not to all users. Next along this progression came Section 508. How many of you does Section 508 apply to you? How many of you know that Section 508 applies to the work that you're doing? Okay. Yeah, specifically the scope of Section 508 is the federal government, use, development, and procurement within the federal government is a contingency of federal funding, and states have come along and adopted 508. It has a pretty wide scope, really. It's a very basic set of guidelines. There are 16 checkpoints that apply to web content. Probably the most important thing you can say about Section 508 is that you can be 508 compliant, yet totally inaccessible to many users. Okay, it's a very, very minimal standard. And it was finalized in 2001, so 2001 was kind of maybe the Model T4 days of the web. Still quite dated. Now 508 is currently in the process of being updated. The technical guidelines and requirements for Section 508 are being updated, and they will, supposedly, we'll see how this shapes out maybe in the next year. I've been saying that for 4 or 5 years. In the next year or so, generally to map or reference directly WCAG 2.0. In short, the current draft guidelines say if you meet the level A and double A requirements of WCAG 2.0, you've met the Section 508 requirements for web content. So WCAG 2.0 is a little bit different in the way that it works. It's more principles-based. It's more technology agnostic. The idea being as technology changes, the principle-based guidelines will still apply. The hope is that they'll have a longer shelf life, right? They'll be relevant longer even as technology changes. And that's very powerful. The difficulty with WCAG 2.0 is because they're very principles-based and kind of ethereal. You're working down here in technology, right? And sometimes it's hard to bridge that gap between what does this principle-based thing tell me I need to do with the technology I'm working with today. And that's a lot of what I'm sure will be happening the next day and a half, is bridging that gap between principles of accessibility and actual, and where the rubber meets the road. So WCAG 2.0 was finalized in 2008. Very good set of guidelines, probably the best formalized set of guidelines that we have. But even with 2008, if Section 508 was the Model T4, then WCAG 2 might be the Ford LTD of the web. And you laugh, I drove this car in college, and it was awesome. At least I keep telling myself that. Wood paneling and all. So even WCAG 2.0 is maybe starting to show a little bit of age, especially with all the innovations we're doing, especially with things like jQuery. So just keep that in mind, that these guidelines are guidelines, okay? Use them as tools to help us achieve true accessibility, which is always about the end user human experience. So your site can be compliant, yet inaccessible, right? That can be a little frustrating. Maybe even to make matters worse, we're hitting rock bottom of this presentation, I promise. Is your site can be technically accessible, yet functionally your site can be technically accessible, yet functionally inaccessible. Let me explain the difference there a little bit, because this is really important to the work that you are and will be doing. You can make something so it technically complies and is technically accessible, but functionally the experience is very poor. The example you might use is a very complex menu navigation system. You could technically make that accessible so the user can use the tab key to navigate through all of the links within that complex menu. And you probably have a system like this on your website. How many times would you have to hit the tab key on your website to get from the top of the page to where the main content of that page begins? Now imagine doing that with a stick in your mouth, like my colleague Gordon does. He's paraplegic, so he uses a stick in his mouth to navigate. Is he going to stick around and navigate, hitting the tab key that many times to get to your main content? Technically accessible? Yes. Functionally accessible? Probably not. So there are ways that we can address this to make things functionally, truly accessible. I always say this, but accessibility is greater than compliance. Compliance is awesome, okay? And I know some of you have requirements for compliance. You can use that as a tool to get to true accessibility. True end user accessibility is always going to be more important and certainly more valuable than merely compliance. So as we start to get into this a little bit more, we'd like to say web accessibility is not rocket surgery. It really is not that complex, especially when you understand the ways that users interact with and use the web. And the approach that I'm going to present, and this is also the foundation of WCAG 2.0, are 4 key principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Really, if you think about it, if something is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, it's going to be accessible regardless of the technology. So, just a brief introduction to these principles. Perceivable is getting content to the user's senses in a way that they can actually start to use that content. So for users with auditory disabilities, this would be users that are both deaf, that are deaf or hard of hearing. If you have multimedia content, say a YouTube video, in a web page, what does this mean? Well, the solution is captions for video and live audio, and text transcripts for all audio content. That will allow the user to perceive that content in a way that's useful to them. They can't hear the audio, but they could see the captions or read the transcript, and it can become perceivable to them that way. So very simple when we consider auditory disabilities, two bullets. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy in implementation. There will be talks later on HTML5 and the media. This is an area where I think scripting and jQuery can be very powerful for interaction, for accessibility, is interacting with media on the web, especially with HTML5. Okay, so that's for somebody that's deaf or hard of hearing. How would somebody that's both deaf and blind perceive web content? I heard it there. Someone said it?
A braille reader.
Yeah, a braille reader. If you think about that, how would somebody that can't see web content and also cannot hear web content, how do they perceive information? They do it through touch, through generally what's called a refreshable braille device. It's a kind of like a keyboard or a device that has pins that form braille characters, and the user can read a line of braille, hit a button, and then the character just will refresh. And I was going to pick on you back there in the back left. She actually has, I saw it when I walked in, you have a refreshable braille device. Would you mind just showing that briefly?
Basically, it has little pins. There are 8 pins because computer braille has 8 dots in it, and this is called refreshable because the pins pop up and down, and it spreads across, and there are keys to put input, and there are other keys to move it around. This has braille and speech output that show. It's my little $4,000 keyboard.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, blind people always have the coolest laptops. They don't have screens and all these keyboards, things like that we are kind of getting away. So, okay, so that's a refreshable braille device. It's interesting. We need to make sure we don't neglect that audience when we consider interaction and content on the web. When you talk about perceivability for users with visual disabilities, primarily talking about blindness. Whoa, it's like it's cut off there. You'll all be partially blind, I guess. You can't see it all. I don't know. There'll be users with blindness, low vision, and color blindness or color deficiency. So for users that are blind, primarily we'll be using a screen reader in which takes text content of a page, and you'll be seeing and interacting with screen readers as part of this, to give an idea of screen reader accessibility. Very cool technology, very frustrating technology, but very powerful for individuals with blindness or maybe low vision. Many users with low vision will enlarge web content, so maybe a portion of the screen so they can see that portion better, or maybe enlarge the entire contents of the screen. This actually is an area where scripting can also be very valuable in handling programmatic focus. If you think about that, often we have things that generate visual focus. They highlight or they flash, or a dialogue that pops up. When it causes visual focus, causes the user to look at it. How is somebody that's using a screen enlarger or maybe navigating with a keyboard to know that something new has appeared on the screen that is commanding focus? Well, we can programmatically set focus to that. That's a big area of scripting accessibility that often causes issues. In our web pages, we can enlarge just the text within our web page, or we can zoom everything. Those are two methods of increasing text content. So you'd want to account for both of those. Users that may increase their text size a little bit, or users that may zoom everything a lot. Some principles to remember with visual disabilities. First, the web pages are linear. A screen reader is going to interact with a web page, and basically read the content of that page from left to right, top to bottom, based on the underlying source code of that document. So I like to think of it as maybe reading a web page by looking through a straw. Right? You can really only see or hear through a screen reader one portion of that page at a time. Screen readers do, however, allow the user to navigate through that page in various ways, maybe navigating by links and form controls using the tab key, or by headings, or by lists, or buttons, or forms, or tables, or landmarks, or a lot of different ways to navigate that is very powerful. So it's important as the user's navigating that you provide a mechanism for them to know where they're at. If your links are all click here, and the user's navigating by links on the page, what would they hear? Click here, click here, click here, click here. It's ambiguous, and really it's ambiguous to everybody. So we want to have meaningful links, avoid ambiguous links that may not make sense outside of their context as much as we can, or maybe provide at a minimum some context that would allow that link to make sense, maybe with a heading or some other structure that would help present what that link means. Also, alternative text for non-text elements, alt text. This is kind of rule number one of accessibility, but a screen reader can't analyze an image and determine what the content of that image is. So we must provide a text alternative for that non-text content that a screen reader can then read in place of the image. And that's, I could talk probably for hours just on alternative text. There's some science, a whole lot of art to alternative text, and certainly some guidelines and rules that I would strongly encourage you to go out, if you're not familiar with, to take some time to learn more about alternative text, because it's probably the area that has the most significant impact on users with visual disabilities, is missing or poor or inappropriate alternative text, or primarily for images. Another thing, when you come to a form and you see the words first name, and next to the words first name you see a text box, you know you probably put your first name into that text box, right? But you know that because you made a visual association based on the proximity of the word's first name to the text box that's right next to it. Well, somebody that's blind can't make that visual association based on proximity, so we need to make an explicit or programmatic association between the word's first name and the text box. We do that in HTML with the label element that associates label text to one particular control, and you'll also be learning how to do that with ARIA, which allows you to do multiple types of associations, maybe between multiple pieces of text to one control, or one piece of text to multiple controls, something you can't do in standard HTML. Also with data tables, when you come to a data table, say a grid, maybe a class schedule, you can look at a particular piece of data and you can visually scan up and down, left or right to determine what that piece of data is based on its row or column headers. Somebody that's blind, again, cannot make that visual association, so we need to make a programmatic association in our markup that associates the piece of data to its particular row and column headers. In HTML, it's very basically done with identifying headers with the TH element, and then giving each header a scope attribute of either COL for column or row for row. By doing that, it associates headers with their column or row, then each piece of data within that data table is then associated to those appropriate headers. And a screen reader can then identify those headers as the user navigates within that table. We also want to, especially, wow, that's really cut off. I might, I'm gonna try to talk and do something here at the same time. I'm gonna try to change my resolution, see if it fixes that. So good contrast. This is, first of all, this is important for everybody, right? Everybody reads things better when there's sufficient contrast, but it's especially important, hey, look at that. It's especially important for users with low vision. Now, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide a measure or threshold for measuring contrast. And that's a very useful tool. It has this really complex formula. If you don't want to do the math, there are tools out there, and I'm sure, I think Paul will be talking about some evaluation tools. We have one that allows you to just put in an RGB, foreground and background color, and it tells you the contrast ratio and whether it passes or fails WCAG 2.0 based on the various thresholds that it has. We also want to make sure that we're not conveying meaning or content or information using color alone. Now, it's real important to know that common sense is vital when considering contrast. In fact, common sense is vital in all aspects of accessibility, but certainly with contrast. On the screen there are various colors here. Are there any guesses as to which of these colors on a white background meet the WCAG requirements and which do not?
Red and blue.
Red and blue, pass or fail? Okay. So they said they all fell? Okay, here's the actual answer. The top 4 passed, the bottom 4 fell. Okay, now it's a little bit weird on the projector, it's a little bit washed out. But what about the 2 colors of gray, right? There's just a little, you can't even see the difference between them. One of them passes, one of them fails. Why? Well, we just look at it, the guidelines draw a line. Anything this side fails, anything this side passes. People don't work that way, right? It's not like, oh, I can read that gray, but oh, the other one, no, I can't read it at all because it fails, right? There's a huge dynamic of the actual user experience. That's why common sense is necessary. WCAG defines thresholds and measures, which are very valuable, but we want to consider the true user impact. As an example, a heading, small piece of bold text that barely fills, will have much less of an impact than a whole section of body text that barely passes, right? Because if it's just barely passing, you're dealing with body text, the impact might be more significant than bold text that barely fills. Does that make sense? We want to consider the impact. If you look at something and say, yeah, you know, I don't know if that has enough contrast, it doesn't fix it. Okay? We're talking about all users here. So, and often we can implement that type of common sense for everybody. Also, color reliance. Just an example of this. Maybe. The green mushrooms listed here are okay to eat. The red mushrooms will kill you.
Oh, no.
Does anybody know their mushrooms well enough to pick some of these? You know, in all the years, and I think Paul actually came up with this example probably a decade ago, all the years we've been using this example, no one's ever said Thymophilus is edible. Just, you know that thing's going to kill you. Okay. All right, there we go. So those are the actual ones. So this is an example of using color alone to convey information or meaning. How could you make this more accessible without relying on color alone?
Off-screen text.
Okay, off-screen text. That's maybe one approach. Okay, so off-screen text would maybe indicate to screen reader users, and that's an important point. If you're blind, you're also colorblind. It's often overlooked, but screen readers don't actually don't generally identify the color of text to users. So if you're relying on color, so there's bold. So that would be one option. Is maybe bold the ones that are poisonous. problem with that again is that for screen readers don't always identify bold text. Even if you use strong or M, which are semantically for emphasis and strong
But you
emphasis.
can use strong and then put a title.
Okay, title, that might be another approach again, but one of the issues with the title attribute is that generally it's not read by screen
A data
readers.
table or a definition list?
Okay, header, let's go here.
A data table or a definition list?
Yeah, okay, definition list or data, but one way to separate them out, right? These ones will kill you, these ones are okay. And that's probably going to be most useful for everybody. Now you can still use the color, right? You can still use color if you want to enhance that for the people that can see the color, but the kids that we don't rely on. Sometimes people say, well, put like a skull and crossbones image or something in there. So let's say we put a skull and crossbone image after Amanita, we gave a good alternative text of will kill you. So now a screen reader comes through and reads, Amanita will kill you, Chanterelle. Now this actually highlights the importance of good semantics. Because if you use a true list with list items, that image would actually be associated within that list item and could then be differentiated. So good markup is really important for things like this. Now, so this affects users that are blind and users that have color blindness or color deficiency. Affects about 7 to 8% of men, about 0.1% of women, about 3.5% of the population overall. Most common form of color deficiency is a red-green color deficiency, difficulty differentiating between reds and greens, which is interesting because what two colors do we use most on the web to convey information or meaning? Yeah, red and green, good, bad, pastel, stop, go, things like that. But this can also affect users with low vision that may override page colors to view them in a color combination that's most useful for them. I might see blue text on a yellow background. That's the color combination that I need, and maybe I magnify that. So when I do that, I override all of your page colors. Okay, so that's a whole bunch to say, don't rely on color alone. Use color all you want. The actual colors don't matter. What matters are those two guidelines. Sufficient contrast, and you're not relying on color alone to convey information or meaning. If you do those, the actual colors don't matter. I don't necessarily recommend a red-green color scheme, maybe for the holidays, but as far as accessibility goes, that's what's most important. Okay, next, operable. Operable is once we can perceive content, we want to be able to use it. We want to be able to navigate and operate within that content. This will primarily affect users with motor disabilities. This population is very diverse. There are a lot of different ways in which a user might operate web content, using the mouse, using the keyboard, using a mouth stick, or a head wand, or eye tracking, voice control, maybe even a very basic switch device. You can run a computer essentially with one button by going through a series of choices and narrowing things down to what you want. It takes a lot of time, but it can be very accessible that way. I also want to talk briefly here about photosensitive epilepsy. How you can, through strobing, flashing content, cause users to have a seizure. This is, in order to cause a seizure, it has to flash more than 3 times per second. It has to be sufficiently big and bright. The color red is also more likely to cause a seizure. WCAG 2.0 defines measures for how big is too big, how bright is too bright, how red is too red. It's really complex and confusing. Don't worry about it. I boil it all down to the annoying rule. If it's big, bright, and flashing more than 3 times per second, has potential to cause a seizure. So don't do it. Where we are seeing this more recently is in HD quality video. You probably don't have home pages that flash, right? But it is an issue with video. So be cautious of that. This is not just an issue of access, right? It's not like somebody can't access that content if it's strobing and flashing. You could kill them, right? By causing them to have a seizure. So be very mindful of it. Generally for those with motor disabilities, we want to ensure keyboard accessibility. Even though there might be a wide variety of types of assistive technologies that someone might use to interact with that content, most of them use or at least emulate keyboard interaction. Okay, so for the most part, you can use your keyboard to interact with everything that you can with the mouse. If you can get the same operation or behavior, then it is going to be accessible. Also want to make sure that you don't remove focus indicators. This means is as you're navigating through a web page, say using the tab key, you want to be able to visually see where you're at within that page, which links or form controls currently have focus as you go through that web page. Very important for sighted keyboard users. Also want to make sure that interactive elements are clearly distinguishable. This is really making it come back with mobile, right? When you look at that page from here, you want to know what things you can interact with, what things you can tap on to perform a function. For links, we saw the lack of underline really go out of style for a while. Now it's kind of really coming back into style, primarily because of mobile. It's a universal indicator that something is a link. It is not a requirement for accessibility, the links be underlined by default, but if they're not, there are some additional contrast requirements. There's also a requirement that the link generally become underlined on both mouse hover and on keyboard focus. So if users can't see the link, maybe they've overridden your page colors, they can still find those links. And ensuring there's a logical reading and navigation order, and that's based on the source code order of your page or document. You can allow users to skip over repetitive or lengthy lists of links. It can be very tedious to navigate, for instance, through your complex navigation system on your website. You can structure the page or provide a link so the user can jump over that. Good error prevention and recovery mechanisms. So it's probably safe to say that most of the frustrations you encounter on the web have to do with forms, right? Did you fill in everything that's required? Did it actually work? If there were issues or problems, what are those problems? How do you find and identify them and then resubmit the form? That can be really problematic for keyboard users, for screen reader users that may not be able to visually see those issues, for users with cognitive or learning disabilities, maybe short-term memory issues, things like that, to really consider the usability and error recovery of your forms. And give users control over time-sensitive changes. So I brought to you today, actually all the way from Utah, I brought you the secret of everlasting happiness. Too bad. You'll have to go back to the slides if you want the secret of everlasting happiness. We sometimes do this on the web though. This is really important. It's so important. You only have 30 minutes for this test. Or this page is updated. Please, has moved. Please update your bookmarks. This page will automatically redirect in 5 seconds. So heaven forbid you give them time to actually read the message, especially if they're using a screen reader or maybe have a reading disability, and then allow them to perform the function. Give the user as much control over time-sensitive information as you can. This is particularly, I don't want to say problematic, but it's an interesting point when we're dealing with dynamic content, AJAX, things like that, especially things that are updating on their own without user interaction. Some interesting approaches there that we can take in considerations for accessibility. Just want to show this real quick. This is an entrance to a courthouse, photo of an entrance to a courthouse. I think it's down in Florida. Does anybody notice anything interesting about this? Anything that might be of an accessibility concern? Okay, now somebody said there's no ramp. There actually is a ramp. It comes up here and takes you right to the landing in the middle of the steps. And that's it. Really, it doesn't take you any further. So, does this provide accessibility? No, not really. I mean, there's something there. And somebody had a checklist somewhere. Oh, wheelchair? Yep. got one of those. Sometimes with accessibility, implementing accessibility part way or incorrectly or incompletely can sometimes be worse than no accessibility at all. I think you could argue that that ramp is probably worse than no ramp at all. If I'm in a wheelchair, maybe the view's really nice from the landing. I don't know. You just wasted the user's time to get there. So you want to think about that, especially in the things you're building, complex widgets and interactions and processes. Think about the entire user process, getting them from the beginning clear to the end. Sometimes in multi-step processes, like a checkout process, that last page may be the least frequented on your website, but probably the most important if you want to make any money, right? For them to actually pay you. And we've seen examples of good accessibility till that last step, and then it breaks down. So consider flows, not necessarily popularity or hit counts for particular pages on your site. Think about the process. Another example here, kind of a little theoretical. Here we have photos of two entrances to buildings. On the left, we have our a wheelchair ramp. You see the wheelchair sign there. On the right, we have a ground level revolving door. It's a little bit hard to tell here, but there's actually some accessibility built into this. There's a button right here, the little wheelchair button. You can hit this and one of two things will happen. One, there's sensors built into the door, and so it can actually revolve with you. If you go slowly or quickly, it can revolve with you. In this case, the door stops and the right-hand side folds open. So if you were in a wheelchair, you could actually just go right through that entrance. So do both of these provide accessibility? Yeah, right? If you're in a wheelchair, you could use either of these approaches to getting in the building. Which provides better accessibility? It's kind of an interesting question. Now, we know the wheelchair ramp provides accessibility, and there's additional benefits to that, right? I can push my kids in the stroller up there, the delivery guy can use that. Maybe somebody that isn't even in a wheelchair but has difficulty with stairs could use that. But in this case, the wheelchair ramp, you can kind of tell just by looking at it, it was added on after the fact, right? It doesn't match the color of the building. It juts out into the sidewalk. It's maybe even a little too steep to be kind of code for wheelchair ramps. But kind of what the wheelchair ramp suggests is, if you have a disability, you go over here. This is your way of getting into the building. I would argue that a universally designed approach to accessibility is better. Let's build one entrance, right? Let's just integrate accessibility naturally and beautifully into that. Sometimes with web accessibility, we see the approach being, oh, well, let's create a screen reader version or a text-only version of the page that users can go to. And that can be dangerous for a few reasons. One of them certainly is potential legal issues there of segregation. But that idea, you people with disabilities, you go over here, just is not all that useful. It's more difficult. Who wants to maintain two versions of their website? And certainly is not very favorable for people with disabilities, that idea if you go over here. So let's build one thing, and you can do that. If you create a truly accessible web page, you have a text-only version of your web page built in naturally into it that's fully accessible. So there's no need to do that. So think about that in your approaches. At the same time, we have to consider that the experiences of people with disabilities will be different, right? They may not interact with your web page the way that you do. So we don't force our experiences or our interactions on people with disabilities, no more so than we drag wheelchairs up the stairs to give them the experience of getting to the second floor, right? We provide a mechanism for them to get there, a ramp, an elevator, or something. I don't even know what this means. I think it's saying that the accessible restrooms upstairs, but I'm not really sure. So anyway, so just some interesting ways to think about the way that we're addressing accessibility. Third principle, understandable, right? We can perceive content, we can interact and operate within it. Now we want it to make sense. We want the messages to be clear and accurate. At least some of you got that. So this will primarily affect users with cognitive and learning disabilities. If we take all of the other disabilities, visual disabilities, hearing, motor, photosensitive epilepsy, we put them all together, those with cognitive and learning disabilities will outnumber them. This is a very, very significant portion of the population. And it affects everybody, right? We all want things to be easy to understand and easy to use. So a few guidelines here. Be careful with movement and other distractors. That little animating banner ad might be mildly annoying to you, but it may render the page entirely inaccessible to somebody with very high levels of distractibility. Good semantic and organization, good headings and lists, things like that. When you come to a big, long web page, what do? You scroll real fast and look for big, bold text, right? So you can get an idea what the content and structure of that page is. By using true headings within your page, you can provide that same mechanism to all users visually, but also to keyboard and screen reader users that can navigate by headings to quickly do the same thing you do, get an idea of the content and structure of that document. Being consistent, following good interaction models and patterns. In ARIA, there are design patterns. These will be your best friend, okay? Get to know these ARIA design patterns. They define for certain types of widgets how the user should interact with them, which means this is how you need to build it so the user can interact with it in a standard way. Strive for brevity. Use the simplest language appropriate to the content. We always joke it's interesting that's the longest bullet on the slide, but be very simple. Interestingly, this is also an area that is not understandability and cognitive disabilities. It's an area that is not addressed well or much at all in the guidelines. Okay? It's hard to define whether something's understandable to a particular user or not. So this is where a lot of common sense, good testing, user testing comes into play. We want to focus the user's attention. You can use animation, things that jQuery UI is really good at, to focus the user's attention on that, which is most important. That will always be the content and functionality. Sometimes we try to focus users to other things. Chunking or simplifying content. Is one really big complex form, is that better than, would it be maybe better to have a 3-step process with smaller portions of a form? There's no answer to that. There's no one answer, right? There is an answer for you, and that can often be determined through common sense and through testing. A lot of this comes down to balancing cognitive load and functionality. Maintaining that functionality but trying to decrease cognitive load. This is a particular concern on home pages, because everybody wants their thing on home page, right? So you have home pages that have a really high cognitive load, a lot of functionality, but really high cognitive load. And how can we maybe maintain that core functionality while decreasing cognitive load? And especially on home pages, that's the gateway to our websites, and often that's the area that people with disabilities are first going to encounter, and can tend to give a bad impression of what they're going to experience later on the site. On the other hand, it can be a really good impression of, wow, this site has implemented accessibility. I'm going to stick with it to find what I'm really looking for. If you consider your typical web design, web development team, this is your typical web developer team, right? They're corner office and white, crisp shirts. They're MacBook with the Apple logo photoshopped out of it. Okay, maybe this is more your typical developer team, right? And I can poke fun. It doesn't get much geekier than me. With their broken lawn chair and their Dell laptop. We had somebody one time say, "Oh, those guys aren't developers; they're outside." There's maybe some truth to that. The point here is that all of you are very adept at using the web, right? You're technical people. If you're like me, I have a web browser open all the time, right? That's where I spend most of my time, is inside that web browser. I have browsers in my trousers, right? I carry this thing around with me all the time. I'm very used to the conventions of using the web. I've developed strategies for searching and skimming past content. I don't even see those banner ads anymore. Not everybody has developed those conventions, right? Or maybe due to disability may not be able to utilize those types of conventions. It's important that we take a step outside of our own experience. Right? Take a step outside of our box and consider how somebody else may interact or use that content. Often our testing involves you getting out of your cubicle and you go next door and you say, "Does that make sense?" And they say, "Well, yeah, it makes sense to me." Well, they are you, right? They probably have the same conventions. This is particularly troublesome on the sites that we're working on and building every single day, right? Because we're so intimately familiar with them. People ask us, should I do accessibility testing with people with disabilities? And I say, no. So what? Why would I not do accessibility testing with people with disabilities? I say, no, don't do that. Instead, do user testing and include people with disabilities. If we do just accessibility testing, we focus on instances of inaccessibility, which can be valuable, but again, we might end up fixing instances of accessibility, but having a broader user experience is still very poor. By doing user testing, you're focusing on a broader experience, and along the way, you can identify those instances of inaccessibility and end up with a better product. And consider who your audience is. You wouldn't take, if you did user test with me and I said, I don't really like the blue, maybe go with green, you wouldn't just change it to green based on the feedback of one user. Right? Don't do that with people with disabilities either, okay? Their insights can be very valuable, but consider that their own expertise, preferences may vary. So be cautious and careful with that. Okay, and then our fourth principle is robust. Robust deals with technology strength. It's kind of an overarching principle over the others. It's browser compatibility. We all love to deal with browsers, right? So it's browser compatibility. Fortunately, this is getting, it's not going away, but it's becoming an easier issue for us as both authors and browsers focus more on following the rules of the web, following technology and coding guidelines and standards for HTML, CSS, for following the rules of the web content accessibility guidelines. It's also hardware compatibility. Okay, so considering small screen devices, adaptive web, responsive web design is great for accessibility, okay, because it allows or accommodates users with different types of technologies that they might be using to present that content. So with robustness, it's certainly looking at the present, it's looking towards the future. You don't want to build something today that doesn't work in tomorrow's technologies. It's also looking backwards. You know, how far back do we go and still address the needs of users with various types of assistive technologies? That's a difficult question. You want to consider your own audience. There's no rule for that. There's nothing defined in the guidelines. Usually, I recommend that you define that line for assistive technologies about the same place you do for browser support. If you're no longer supporting IE6 or IE7, you can kind of draw your assistive technology support maybe about the same place. This is becomes especially of interest with ARIA, which we'll be talking about, where it really is only supported by newer technologies. We talk about robustness. This is awesome for present and future technologies, but we want to maybe consider the implications for technologies that don't support ARIA. Okay, so those are our four principles. Hopefully a good foundation understanding of accessibility. Regardless of the techniques that we implement, regardless of the guidelines, if you think about these four principles, no matter what you do, if you meet those four principles, it's going to be accessible. And while the principles and these guidelines are very, very valuable, we can also use tools to help us along in this process. Now, tools are valuable, but they're never going to be a good replacement for gray matter, right? For a human with a brain. This is where the expertise that you're going to gain over these days will be very valuable. We're going to talk about tools. Paul will be talking about evaluation tools tomorrow, and use them as tools. Right? They're not the end-all, be-all of accessibility. Neither are guidelines. No tool can tell you if your site is accessible. Compliance with any set of guidelines cannot tell you if your site is accessible. The only way to tell if your site is accessible is by actually using it as a person. So use these all to assist or supplement or support that human evaluation process. Just a little shameless plug, we have a tool called Wave. If you want to check it out, it's wave.webin.org, free tool. We also have a Firefox Toolbar. I think Paul might be talking about it tomorrow. It's a tool we have developed as a community service to maybe help you with accessibility. So if it helps you in your accessibility implementation or evaluation process, we invite you to go check it out. And just in conclusion, I love this quote. For people with disabilities, technology makes things convenient, whereas for people with disabilities, it makes things possible. For you, online banking is convenient, right? You could probably still go down to your local branch and bank if you want to. Not everybody can do that, right? Online banking makes things possible, makes banking and commerce possible for some users with some disabilities. The power, I think, of scripting, and particularly jQuery, is it allows things to be conveniently possible, right? It allows us to do amazingly powerful things really easily. And I just want to just the impact that you can have in the lives of people with disabilities is so significant. In these 2 days, I think, I know we come out of this having done some work that really is going to have a notable impact. And then as you go back, you can continue that. So, thank you. We may have just a minute. If there are any questions, we'll take those as we're switching presenters here.